the more that you've talked about this, the more you've seen me like lean down and like look at my lap. I've been like writing notes because I'm seeing a bunch of connections between the songs more than I had before. Um,
When I was walking my dog, I was actually thinking the same thing when I was playing the Led Zeppelin record.
that's a dirty freaking record. Like it's
When we talk about that record, I'm going to tell you something insightful, and I'm glad you brought up the sample side
mhm.
of this because our notes are about to connect flawlessly, like when we flip over. Because I
Yeah.
love the fact that you brought up the sample for this record
Hmm.
because when we get to what my first notes are, you're going to be like, oh, it's going to make.
And the other connection that I thought of, just as you were saying, that was Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant particularly, the tall blonde lead singer, um, was
Very
also
much a
had a line of women out the
yes.
door coming
Oh no,
after him too. Like
no, I
that's
was
another one of those connections, and then that was real life too,
no, no,
for
no.
him.
I heard the Robert Plant stories too. That's why I was kind of
It's
you about. Were you thinking? Well, that was going to be one of my questions for you. Is that were you thinking about Robert Plant's Playboy
mm,
persona and adulation by the women when?
yeah.
Because I'm not. I'm. I'm gonna tell you the truth. I'm more familiar with his appeal to the women than I am even with the group.
Hmm. The yeah, he's we'll talk about this more in a minute, but like he and it's not overstating it to say that all four members of Led Zeppelin could, if they're not the best musicians on their instruments or their vocals in rock history, they are certainly the most, certainly some of the most influential and the most widely imitated. Like the
Okay.
entirety of most of the 70s and all of the hair metal bands of the 80s, they're all trying to be Robert Plant. Like all that's the person they're trying to imitate.
Oh, that's okay. So he's the prototype. And
Hmm.
this band is the prototype.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about Led Zeppelin. I mean, I'm mostly just
Mm.
familiar with Robert Plant, obviously, like I just stated before.
Um, all right. I think this is a good place to start. That they are one of, in my head anyway, one of the like OG bands. Like we talk about bands that everything that came after them is taken from them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you have Beatles, Stones, obviously. You have the Clash as the first punk band. I mean, they weren't really the first, but they also brought melody to it a little bit. Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Kraftwerk, which is the original like electronica kind of. They use the synthesizers and stuff. Um, but Zeppelin is one of those bands that pretty much every band um, in the white world that comes after 1970 or 75 um, has stolen something from one of those bands is taken those six influences and mixed them in some way. And then obviously, like solo artists are also pulling from Dylan and Joni Mitchell and people like that. And they're also, and hip hop artists are pulling from, George Clinton and pulling from James Brown and pulling, I mean, they're pulling from lots of different places, but you can hear influences. I don't know of any band that has come along since like 1970 that's not some combination of those six bands. And Led Zeppelin is one of those. So that it's electrified blues basically. It's taken the Robert Johnsons of the world, like the old blues singers, and running it through huge amplifiers is really essentially what it's doing. Like even the Lemon Song, which is comes from the Led Zeppelin 2, the second album they produced, which is one a whole lot of loves on, was I'm pretty sure that is a Robert Johnson song, which is also an incredibly dirty song. Squeeze your lemon and let the juice run down my leg, like that kind of metaphor going on. Robert Plant and Mick Jagger are the two like types of lead singer, I guess, right? In rock and roll world. Um, I guess Lennon and McCartney are the other, but like they're playing the instruments and stuff like that. But Mick and Robert Plant are the two that are sing only singers essentially. They're not like playing instruments at the same time.
Right, 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 right. Okay.
And Mick is peacocking around the stage. strutting, whatever. Robert Plant is not completely standing still, but more standing still. And he's also I mean, he's wearing the tight pants and the whole deal. Like you follow that genealogy through, David Lee Roth and through even Eddie Vedder. And I mean, all of them are in that kind of Robert Plant genealogy, I guess. All four of the members of the band, though, you could argue the same thing for the Who, in fact, too. But are the like archetypal people in that, like singer, guitarist, bassist, drummer, um, Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham. The archetypal characters, I guess, in that thing,
In what,
and they're the ones that people who came after them copied in many
in what way?
ways. Um,
Yeah. Hey, explain some of the ways that
okay,
they.
so Robert Plant we've talked about a little
Right.
bit already. He's at least at that time is the sex addict, and the one that all the girls are screaming about.
Mhm.
He is like tall and blonde and wild haired and so forth, and is a tight pants, tight shirt, like the sex symbol, I guess, and has a really high voice, singing and wailing almost. Um,
Mhm.
Jimmy Page he wasn't a heroin addict at this point, but was later in the 70s. Is pulling from the blues scale and the blues tradition primarily. He actually comes from a band previous to this called the Yardbirds. Have you heard of the Yardbirds?
It sounds vaguely familiar,
Okay. That
like
was a
very.
band that Jimmy Page was in with Jeff Beck, who's a other famous guitarist from, and
Familiar.
a guy called Eric Clapton. You also might have heard of. Yeah,
Very.
clearly, that was a joke, but like, so that's like three of the great rock and roll guitarists all in the same band, in the mid late '60s, and it's a band called the Yardbirds.
Okay.
Um,
Most of this stuff flashes through my mind via my
yeah.
time at Manifest, and
Mhm.
so like it's like no, I can remember the Yardbirds albums being
Mhm.
there. You know, that's
Yeah.
what I mean. I don't know. I can vaguely remember like stocking that band up. You know what I mean? But not really.
Mm. So Jimmy Page is the archetypal guitarist, long dark hair, like playing. I mean, think of like Slash from Guns N' Roses, or I mean, like all of them are coming from like the
They're coming.
Jimmy Page and Eddie Van Halen, and I mean, all of them are coming from that school. I mean,
Okay.
Van Halen sped up, obviously, but like um, they're all coming from that school of a lead guitarist as being like the secondary sex symbol from the band. Um,
Right.
John Paul Jones is the producer and the bass player. He's also the serious one. He's the one who kind of holds everything together in while everybody else is off. Not that he's not partying some too, but like he's the one holding it together in the midst of all of the chaos going around him. Um, and the beat, I mean, he's part of the rhythm section, right? So he's keeping the beat, like the groove going to like as part of the band. And he's played. I wish I'd looked it up, but he's like played on lots of other projects and produced lots of other things too outside of Led Zeppelin.
I have two thoughts. Two of my first notes. Um, you want to hear what they are, or
Sure.
I want to make sure that you kind of like giving me all the information that I need.
And the drummer is a thing that we need to talk about too. But you can ask questions now. We can come back to John Bonham, he's a whole different animal, so to speak.
No, no, no. Let's okay. So right now we've covered how many band members? Now we got
Therefore,
okay. So we got Robert Plant,
hmm
our lead singer, and he's our Mick Jagger. And
hmm
and what time is and what era is Led Zeppelin?
Led Zeppelin is late '60s through 1980.
Okay, so they're coming on the heels
hmm
of okay, and then there's Jimmy.
Jimmy Page, yeah.
Now Jimmy Page did a lot of dope solo stuff too because his name sounds super familiar. He
Mhm.
has his own solo catalog, correct?
He plays with other people too, yeah.
That's probably why. And then
John Paul Jones
John Paul Jones, and
is the
this
bass player, but he's
that's
also he's a producer. He's also a producer on lots of other records, not just Zeppelin records.
and then we have a drummer.
John Bonham, yeah, who is
He sounds familiar too.
yeah,
John Paul, guy who doesn't sound familiar, actually.
no, he is the most quiet of the group. Um, he is. both in the band and in the wider world, the more laid back, conscientious, not publicity seeking. I mean, none of them are now, but like at that point, where he was not the camera facing one, so to speak, right?
Right.
He was not the one that all the girls were screaming about. So, um, but John Bonham was, it's not much of an exaggeration that to say that like the Muppets animal, the Muppet that plays the drums
Yeah.
everywhere, is
And
taken from him and Keith Moon, who's the Who's drummer. Um,
okay.
he was a wild motherfucker, man. Like he was a serious alcoholic. He died in this is what how the band ended. He died in October of 1980, which a little more than a month before John Lennon was shot, actually, um,
Of what?
from alcohol poisoning. He drank. I just looked it up. He drank like over 40 shots of vodka in one day, and which is like a bottle and a half essentially, and it was just and honestly, that's probably following a couple days of drinking too.
Probably consecutive.
But
So
yes,
probably been
but yeah, he is alcohol poisoning. He died, and the band ended after that because they didn't want to play really without him. Um, he is one of the most iconic drummers that's ever been.
it is
He's
it is
it,
death further. Was he really that great of a drummer? I just have to ask respectfully because sometimes in hip hop terms,
mhm,
somebody might get edified or deified a little bit higher than maybe they actually were in reality.
mhm. No, he was that good. I mean, he's not like Neil Peart from Rush. He's not like that technically proficient.
Right.
And not in the same kind. He's not the same kind of drummer. Or who's the lady that drummed for Prince? I've lost her name.
Sheila E.
Yeah, her. Like he's not like that kind of drummer. Um,
Right.
but in that he's a drummer that everybody that came after him in a rock and roll sphere has taken from him. Absolutely. Um, the if you want to hear like iconic drum records that was on, there's a song on this album, Led Zeppelin 2, called Moby Dick, that is almost a 7 or 8 minute drum solo essentially. I mean, it's like it's pretty nuts. The most famous drum lick that he has is probably from Zep 4. It's a song called When the Levee Breaks. Um, and the drum to that is one of those drum licks that everybody has stolen from. It's got like an echo on it, because they were trying to figure out how to make it sound the way he heard it in his head. So he actually took the drum kit in the stairwell and they recorded it in a stairwell to have the echo in it.
Of the reverb. Yeah.
Mhm. So yeah, no, he is that good.
Okay.
Hey y'all, thanks for making it to the end of this video. If you love this, check out this video right here. It's another one that where Coop and I are talking about how two songs go together that you wouldn't maybe think go together. So thanks for hanging out. We'll see you next time.